Welcome back to Sledgehammer Horror, guys. I am Ken Sledge, and let's talk horror. Now, today I am joined by the amazing co-host of the Puppet Masters Castle Freaks podcast, Jarrod Hornbeck. Jarrod, how you doing today, man?
I'm doing amazing, man. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
No, this is such an honor for me, man. I've been very excited to work with you. But before we talk about why you're here, I would like for the people that don't know you to get to know you a little bit. Jarrod is a teacher, writer, and podcaster based out of Brooklyn, New York, where he lives with his wife, Melissa, and their elderly Sphinx cat, Cleo. So, obviously, being a teacher and a podcaster, those are two things that are very, very time consuming. So, I don't want to get too personal, but are you a teacher in like the elementary, junior high, high school range?
So yeah, I teach elementary school. So that's what I do for a profession. And the podcast is something that I do as a hobby because it's something that I love and I love to spend time talking about. So I managed to find the time, although with the school year starting just now,
Mhm.
time is I'm gonna have to be a little more clever with how I use my time. The summer was nice because Steve and I were able to double, triple book and record a bunch of shows at once. We had a lot of flexibility, and now I don't have as much, so we have to be a little bit more creative with how we use our time.
Right. And we talk about how you're a writer and a podcaster as well. For people that haven't heard the podcast, can you tell us a little bit about what you guys do over at the podcast?
Sure. So I'll make one amendment to the name. So when the name is spoken, and this is something that everyone has been doing, everyone has been sharing it because of the way our graphic was made. When Steve and I say it in speaking, we say Puppet Masters and Castle Freaks, but there's no and or ampersand or anything in the logo. So
Okay.
people who've been plugging it for us and doing it have been doing the same thing. Really, we don't care that much about it. But what the podcast is we decided a while back. Steve and I were working on another show together. We've been podcasting together for a couple years now, and we were part of a Sopranos recap show a while back, and then in conversations, and we were doing a pop culture Patreon show for another podcast network, and we would have these conversations where we would realize, oh, wait a minute, you read It Came from the Video Aisle, like the Full Moon Features book history? And I was like, yeah. And so we talked about that, and then Charles Band's autobiography came out. And just kind of as a joke, we were like, man, wouldn't it be funny if for like a podcast, if like we watched every Full Moon movie or every Charles Band movie? And then we talked about it and we went, well, that's probably like a really niche market and probably not a lot of people are doing it. So we looked into it and there really was no one else doing exactly that. So we were like, let's do it. Like, let's try to make it happen. And we picked up a copy of his autobiography and we read it and we talked about, well, how would we start this off? And basically what we do is we watch every single movie that Charles Band produced. So you're talking Empire, you're talking Full Moon Features, you're talking stuff he produced just independently, Charles Band Productions production. I mean, this is hundreds of movies. So
Yeah.
the well is not going to dry up anytime soon.
Well, and it's amazing because, like you said, that is a niche market. So when you have the people that are the fans of the podcast, they're going to be dedicated fans because they're, a lot, especially like you said, Charles Band, Full Moon. Those are the people that they are dedicated to that craft.
I will echo that, and I'll tell you that when we started it, like I said, it was kind of half jokingly, and we were thinking like we'll get this podcast out, and for the first like 2 years of us doing this, it's going to be our friends and family pity listening for us so that we can get a couple of downloads here and there, and then it just happened to catch on at the right time with the right audience, and all of a sudden it sort of took off and took a life of its own, which we weren't expecting. And people who I had never met before, who found the show in other countries, were writing us emails and saying, like, we love that you're doing this. Like, we're such big fans of Full Moon and of these movies. We love that you're taking the time to really explore them and do these episodes where you're not just a bad movie podcast where you're just coming on and being like, this movie sucks. Ha ha ha. Like, we're really analyzing the movies and giving them all a chance to picking out what works and highlighting that. And, maybe we say some negative things too, but people, the feedback has been amazing. And it's just the fan base for this particular niche has come out of the woodwork, and it was more than we could have possibly imagined. It's been amazing.
Well, and the best thing about that, guys, is you don't have to go far to find the podcast because I have all the links down in the description, as well as the links for Jarrod's social media. So make sure you're following him on social media. Make sure you're subscribing to the podcast on whichever platform that you listen to your podcast on, so you can become part of that niche family as well. Because if you're a horror fan, you're probably a pretty big fan of Charles Band and Full Moon. So I'm sure that you guys will find something there that you absolutely love and enjoy. So you talked about how you guys started the podcast kind of jokingly. When did you realize, like, wow, this is actually kind of fucking dope?
Well, Steve and I take our work pretty seriously. So even though it was a joke, the idea was sort of a joke. Once we decided, no, we're going to do this, we were like, well, we need to do it right. So we went back to our books. We went back to It Came from the Video Aisle. We went back to Charles Band's autobiography. We watched a bunch of supplemental stuff like the Full Moon video zones that are on YouTube, and read a bunch of other reviews and listicles, articles. And we're just, and we set it up and we made an Instagram, and we didn't really have too many people following it in the beginning. I mean, we still have a pretty modest Instagram following for the show, but again, this is something that it's gradually snowballing and reaching a bigger and bigger audience. And so we created the Instagram, and immediately a couple people who were involved in Full Moon movies saw the Instagram and started following it and started liking stuff that we were posting even before we had an episode dropped.
That's
and
cool.
So I think we realized, oh no, this is something people want, which was maybe we weren't really sure of at first, but it was like, people want this, so let's do it. And we decided, okay, so what should the first like 4 or 5 movies we do be? We want to try to hit a classic Full Moon, a classic Empire. We want to hit a late stage Full Moon. We want to hit maybe like a Torchlight or a Moonbeam, so that we kind of cover all our bases right away and don't just come right out the gate with the top 5 most popular ones so that everyone stops listening after a month and a half. But we realized then, we were like, oh man, like this is something we're going to take seriously, and hopefully people are going to be appreciative of that. And then once we started recording, we record pretty far in advance. Like we generally at any given time are recording probably 5 weeks ahead on our show. And so once we had our 5 weeks recorded and waiting just for that first episode to drop, and then for the next one, it felt like torture because we're just sitting on these episodes that we had in the can. And it was like, once that was happening, it was like, oh no, we think we have a pretty good product here and we're excited to get it out there. And it's not just 2 idiots being stupid on a show. I think, bring a lot of historical context and information and a little bit of humor and some tangents and some anecdotes, but we really try to keep the episodes, a good length and hit people with what we think they want. And so far it's been great and feedback's been terrific.
And that's awesome, man, because especially it's like a baby, like you want this to be successful. You want to raise it the right way and make sure that it's doing the right things. And I completely understand where you're coming from. And when you're talking about, having a lot of bullets in the gun, I try to record 3 to 4 interviews a day and release them every other day. So that way I've got a back stock in case, God forbid, something happens to somebody close to me, or I got to do, that I don't lose episodes because I have to do personal things. So
exactly.
I totally understand where you're coming from there too. You want to make sure you have a back stock so that way you can, if you need the time off, you can take it and still be comfortable with what you're doing.
Right. It's like something tells me that this beginning of this school year is going to have me and Steve discussing maybe, a week or 2 off because we've got a lot of stuff already recorded and ready to be released. And that's the other thing too, is we'll advertise, like, I'll put a post that'll say like, here's a sneak preview of the episodes coming up over the next like 4 or 5 weeks. And it's like someone will see something in there and it's like one of the Full Moon titles that they love. And I know they're waiting for that one. And once I advertise it, I want to have it out there. It's like, I'm waiting for it too. It's like the Demonic Toys is the episode that's dropping this week at Friday. And it's like, people have been asking, when's Demonic Toys? When's Demonic Toys? And it's like, I've been sitting on it and I want to just give it to people.
Right. I get it. I completely, because I usually have guests, so I hate making them wait. Like, hey, your episode will be out next month. Like, really? Like, yeah, I'm sorry. So, man, in order for you guys to start a podcast, especially around Charles Brand and, Full Moon, horror had to start for you somewhere. So, Jarrod, now I would like to go back to the past and talk about what got you started in the horror genre, your first horror movie, And Jarrod, the first horror movie that you watched was.
Okay, so I'm breaking the rules slightly here. I have two of them. One of them is just really brief and anecdotal, only because that maybe was like the initial catalyst. But the second one I'm going to talk about is like the big one, the one that really pushed me over the edge into something that wasn't just a curiosity, but an interest. So we'll go back to the past. We'll go back to, I'm going to say like 1986, maybe. I was in kindergarten, I think. And I was sleeping over my best friend's house, my best friend from childhood. And he had two older sisters who I think if we were like six, they were about 12 and 14. And so the 12-year-old had a sleepover and her friends rented, it had just come out on video, I think, Friday the 13th, part 5, A New Beginning. And I remember going into the video store and seeing that cover with the pink glowing lights coming through the mask. And, I was too young and not seasoned enough to recognize that that was Roy's mask and not Jason's mask. But, that's a conversation for another time. But they said to us, "Oh, you're too little. You're not allowed to watch this." And they kicked us out of the living room. And what my friend and I did was we realized there was a staircase. And if you walk down to the bottom of the staircase and you sat at a certain angle on the bottom step, you could see into the living room on an angle to see the TV, but the people who were sitting on the couch couldn't see you. So we sat, the two of us, and we couldn't really hear it. Like we could make out like, stings and loud parts in the music, but there's imagery from that movie that I'll never forget. I remember seeing probably my first pair of boobs, if I'm being honest with you, because there's a bunch of them in that movie. But when the guy gets his head crushed with the belt, that was one that stuck with me. Seeing that, so that visual, and to the point where when I went back to the Friday series proper a couple years later, I remember being like, oh wait, 5, I think that's the one when the guy gets his head crushed. And then watching it again a few years later, it was really rewarding, being like, oh yeah, this is it. This is the one. This is where it happens.
Yeah.
And so just the idea of like, this is something you're not supposed to see was obviously really appealing to a young kid. And that one stuck with me. Maybe a year and a half later or so. So I grew up in Queens, New York, and we had a little mom and pop video store right on our block, which was awesome. And so we would walk down to the video store, and they had a cardboard cutout standee of Freddy Krueger and a display for Nightmare on Elm Street 3 Dream Warriors, which was just coming out on home video. And that movie, I had heard the name Freddy Krueger. I had probably seen the character before, but never this close up. And immediately I looked at the VHS box and the cover art and the back. And if you remember the pictures that are on the back of the VHS, it's like Patricia Arquette being eaten by the Freddy worm.
Yes.
All other things. And I looked at that and I was like, man, I need to know what this is. Like, I need this immediately. So I struck a deal somehow with my parents where I was like, hey, I'm not scared of this. Like, I want to see this. And my parents, I don't remember this conversation happening, but they must have said, we'll let you rent it, but if you're scared of it, you're never going to rent one of these movies again. So I rented it. And not only was I not scared of it, I became head over heels obsessed. I had Freddy fever immediately. I was about 7, going on 8 years old maybe. And I was just so obsessed with Freddy to the point where like it became my Halloween costume. It became, I ended up doing the old, I was lucky enough to have a VCR in my bedroom. Well, this is probably a couple years later, actually. At the time, I think my dad still had some kind of in with like home video distribution. He worked at the time for a record company. And I think he got, because he used to get my older cousin swag all the time. And he got my cousin, I remember, like a big Doc and Dream Warriors poster.
Yeah.
Because my cousin was a bit older than me and was a metalhead at the time. And so I think he got me part 1, part 2. And I think I ended up with a store-bought copy of part 3 as well. And I would watch them incessantly over and over again. And to the point where when part 4 came out in theaters, my mom let my 16-year-old cousin and his 16-year-old friend take me to that movie unsupervised. So I saw part 4 in the theater, which was like going to a concert and seeing the biggest rock star in the world on
Yeah.
stage. Like I didn't know what to do with myself I was like in second grade or something. And I was like just beside myself. But Dream Warriors was my gateway. It was, and I'll tell you, I think I knew from second one that this movie was gonna be special to me.
Mhm. Well, and a lot of people, this is the fan favorite, I think, in the franchise. I think this is really the one where people really gravitate to because it's really easy to root for all the kids and Freddy in this movie. You're not just rooting for Freddy to tear through all the kids throughout the whole movie. So, we know you were quite young. Your parents let you rent the movie the first time you had seen it, but do you remember which scene it was that affected you the most?
I could tell you exactly what scene it was, and I was already enjoying the movie. There were effects and scenes that were resonating, but to me, the scene where Freddy turns Philip into a marionette puppet by ripping out his like veins and tendons and walking him through the hospital like a puppet, that scene, not only was it, I probably tried to hide a little bit how it did freak me out, but I didn't want to, lead on too much and get my horror privileges taken away at such a young age. But that scene really struck me. And the thing that I remember most was the first time I saw there's a shot. I mean, obviously Freddy's gloves slashing,
Yeah.
down his arms and legs, and the veins and tendons pulling out is such an amazing effect, practical effect. But there's a scene where he's walking, and the point of view shows his feet, and you see like up halfway up his foot is just open. And I remember, I think this was probably the reason why I was allowed to continue renting movies like this, was because rather than hide behind something and scream, I looked at that and I went, oh my God, somebody made that. Like that's somebody made a fake foot to look like a real foot. Like I was looking at it from the makeup effects and the practical effects, to the point where through elementary school, and I would say even through middle school, I sort of, one of my dreams was when I grew up to be like a prop master or a makeup designer for horror movies. I mean, it never came to fruition because when I was graduating high school, I had to make a choice, and I was either going to go to art school or I was going to go to school for education, and I ended up going to school for education instead. But yeah, I would look at it like that and be like, wow, how did they do that? Like, I know it's not real, so how did they make it look so real? And then I think I adopted that discerning eye when I would watch horror movies after that. I would put something on and I'd be like, oh, I can see how this is kind of, I mean, we're getting a few years down the line, but I'd be like, oh, I can kind of see where the latex ends here. And I can see how this person would be maneuvered so that the effects person is under them with, with an arrow or with a harpoon or something. And that was kind of how I approached it. And I just loved the aesthetic of it so much that I not only was I not scared, but by the, I mean, by the time 1990, I remember when Freddy's Dead came out, I was so excited to get the VHS that came with the 3D glasses.
Yep.
And I remember by that time, I had already had the whole collection. I had all the other 5 movies. I had every Friday the 13th. I had Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Interestingly, I only had Halloween 4 and 5. And Halloween 7, 1978 is actually my all-time favorite movie. And I hadn't seen it yet at that time because I thought that it was going to be old and boring and stuffy. Like, I'm like, it came out in the 70s, not the 80s. I don't want that movie. And then I ended up getting it and it became my favorite movie of all time. But, and I had a bunch of random other stuff too. Like I would just tape stuff off cable. And so I was the kid who, when I was in like 6th grade, my friends would come over and sleep over at my house, and my parents would go to bed, and I'd be like, okay, what do you want to pop in that you're not allowed to watch at home? And we would watch all these things. And then, normally it was fine. Every once in a while, I would have a friend who would go home and chicken out. And then my mom would get like an angry phone call. Why'd you let my kid watch this movie? And, my mom had to do some explaining, I think, on my behalf. But I was, in that regard, I was a bad influence, not in any other, but just in that way.
Right. Well, I mean, and that's one of those things where we all had that friend that we went to their house. And I was that friend too, because my mom and dad owned a mom and pop video store called
Oh,
Downtown
that's
Video.
awesome.
So yeah, I always had. That's what got me started in horror, was just walking up and down the horror aisle, looking at all the different covers and trying to figure out what movie I wanted to watch. So I totally get it. I was that bad influence as well. And with the Dream Warriors, this is a movie that has really stood the test of time as well. Like, people talk about wanting another Nightmare on Elm Street remake or following the story of a Nightmare on Elm Street. And, for me, if you're not doing a legacy sequel, I don't really think there's a reason to continue that part of the franchise. But
Sure.
I always ask people, would you like to see your first horror movie remade today? And with this being a third part of the franchise, it'd be kind of hard to remake it. But would you like to see them tackle another version of the Dream Warriors today?
I don't see why not. I mean, I think, I think the thing you run into with a lot of movies that get remade is you look at the original movie and you say, okay, there's a cool concept here, but this was maybe made on the cheap, and this movie was a $500,000 budget movie or something. There was things that at the time they couldn't do. So it's almost like, well, now if you pump a little more money into that, you could get somebody who loves the property, reveres the property, to write something, and then you can put some more money into it, and you can maybe improve upon certain areas where the originals were lacking, whether it's budgetary, whether it's performance, production, something that they didn't have the proper amount of money and time. Time is a big one too, because a lot of these things were made quickly. But with something like Dream Warriors, I think for a low budget movie, and I mean, I'm doing this off the top of my head, but I think I remember reading that it was like a $4 million movie at the time or something like that, which even in 1987 was a low budget movie.
Sure.
And so it's not, this isn't, I was trying to think of the cheapest movie I can think of off the top of my head. This isn't Graduation Day or Final Exam. This is a movie that, had some money. So even though it's low budget, I think they did a really great job with the practical effects. Like, I don't really look at Dream Warriors and think, oh, I wish this didn't age so poorly. There are a couple. I mean, I love stop motion animation. Mm-hmm. So for me, when the stop motion Freddy skeleton, yeah, it looks dated and it's occasionally silly looking, but you know what? I would that would be my caveat. Remake Dream Warriors, get someone who loves Dream Warriors to write it, put some more money into it so they can do some really fantastical stuff, but do everything practical.
Yeah.
I would want to know, that would be my caveat, a no CGI or very little CGI Dream Warriors.
Yeah, use CGI as the salt and pepper on your practical effect mashed potatoes. Let that be your seasoning over top of your practical effect.
Exactly.
And the Dream Warriors, like I said, it's a movie that you really are rooting for all the kids throughout the movie too. There's not really a main character in the movie that you're like, fuck this person. But we know what scene affected you the most, being the marionette scene. But what would you say your favorite scene from the Dream Warriors is?
My favorite scene from the movie, I would say, I mean, if we're talking just something that brings a smile to my face because I can look at this in hindsight with what would follow, I mean, it's got to be Welcome to Prime Time, bitch. Welcome to Prime Time, bitch. It's not my favorite kill, but that line just takes that scene and elevates it. And it's just, I love the fact that it's Dick Cavett talking to Zsa Zsa Gabor about acting advice. It's the oddest scene. Like, it's the last person you would want to take acting advice from. And Jennifer is watching it because she wants to be an actress. So I almost feel like that placement is intentional. It's like, we want this to be we want the audience to be one beat ahead How do we know
Right.
this is a dream? Oh, someone's talking to Zsa Zsa Gabor about acting advice. I love that aspect of it. And just Freddy's head coming through the top of the TV, as implausible as it is, the effect looks great. And it is, to my knowledge, a Robert Englund um,
Improv line.
improv line. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was an improv line. And I do recognize that the one-liners, Freddie does sort of evolve or devolve, I guess, depending on how you look at it, into like a, comedian from the Catskills through parts 4, 5, and 6, or into a Looney Tunes cartoon. But I do think that even if this sort of spawned the jokey Freddie, it's such an iconic moment. Like
Yeah.
I love it so much. And I also love the tricycle with the blood tire tracks.
Hmm.
That visual to me, with the pedals moving by themselves and the blood tracks. There's just so much, there's so much good stuff. The first reveal of the chest of souls
Yeah.
is really pretty incredible. There's a lot there. And I always used to like the scene where Craig Wasson is talking to Amanda Kruger in in like the room of the asylum. It was always a really ominous scene where she's telling him about what happened. She does the exposition about how Freddy Krueger was born, and they have the little discussion about faith and science. And I always really like that scene a lot too. But I think you're totally right. I think what makes this movie different from a lot of the movies is that even though we're getting character types, they're more fleshed out than they would be in a lot of the slashers. So even though maybe they're not as fully fleshed out as they would be in a prestige drama, you still think something about these kids, and it's not just like the blonde, the brunette, the
Right.
hunky guy, the jock. It's like they are a little Breakfast Clubby, but not not fully.
Right. And you one of the scariest scenes to me is when you're talking about like the marionette scene, when Joey's running through the hall and he's trying to communicate with people and let them know that something's wrong, and he's hitting that lunch tray on the doors. Like, such a scary scene when I was a kid. Like,
Mm-hmm.
he knows that he's got to try to help him, and that's the only thing he can do to try to help because he's mute.
Absolutely.
Like, that was one of those ones that I thought was really, really scary too. Um, Now, another question I always ask, because we are talking about a franchise film,
Sure.
A Nightmare on Elm Street is a bigger franchise. So we know that the Dream Warriors is where the Nightmare journey started for you. But what would you say your favorite Nightmare on Elm Street film is?
Dream Warriors.
Is it?
Yeah, and I have sort of a hot take. So I was even debating if I should say this because again, I know you plugged our socials and you want people to look for the show and find the show, and I don't want to piss anyone off. No, I love the first movie. I really do. I think it's a good movie. It's a great concept. It's a good movie. And I've seen it countless times. I know the dialogue by heart. I know every scene by heart. So I don't want anyone to think I'm disparaging it. There's something about part 4 that I really like, but the problem with part 4 is that it really suffered from the writer's strike in 1988. So Brian Helgeland was writing that movie, and I feel part 4 has a real first draft feel to it. But I think there's so many fun effects that I was having a conversation with someone, and I was saying that if part 4 had time to gestate and they took another year to write a couple more drafts and really come up with how can we even enhance this, beef this up, and improve on some of these set pieces, I think it potentially could have been the best one. I don't think it is. I kind of go 3-1, either Dream Warriors, Nightmare 1, and then 4 and 2 I flip-flop on.
Yeah.
I've grown to like part 2 a lot more. I think I enjoy watching part 4 more than part 2, but I enjoy talking about part 2 more than part 4, if that makes sense. Like, I think there's a lot to dissect in Freddy 2.
And it's funny because part 4 is my favorite in that franchise. I've been a fan of the Dream Mask. I think it's because it's the one I watched the most as a kid. Like,
Sure.
is it a perfect movie? No. But it's just my favorite because that's the one that like I said, I watched the most as a kid. There's so many parts of that movie that I think are so well done. Like you said, the cockroach kill. sucking face with Sheila. Like, there's just so much of that movie that I love so much.
And I think if they had more time, they probably could have found a more ceremonious way to transfer Kristen's powers to Alice without dismantling the surviving Dream Warriors.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, let's be honest, we all love Kincaid. It was all sad to see Kincaid go. And he's a favorite of everyone. And so I think there was a way for it to be done. And I just think I really like the bones of part 4. And I think had they had proper time to go over it, bang out a few more drafts, try a few things out, expand upon some of the established stuff, you could have had a really great entry. And instead, I feel like you have what falls somewhere between like a passable and a good entry. I mean, I still like it. Like, I'd throw it on from time to time. But if you said to me, like, you can only take two of them with you to a desert island, I'm taking 3 and I'm taking 1.
Sure. And I've always said 4 is my favorite. 1 is probably the best just because of the budget they had. I mean, Robert Englund was on screen for like 7 minutes in that movie because they didn't have the budget to keep doing the makeup. And then part 3 is probably just like the most fun one. Like, you're rooting, like, that's the one you have the most fun watching. So, like, in the first 4, I don't think there's a bad entry. I agree with you. Part 2's grown on me. When I was young, it was too dark, but part 2 has my favorite scene of any nightmare film when you have the poolside massacre. You know, you're all my children now. Like,
Right.
that's you don't get to see that in a Freddy movie. You don't get to see him go after a bunch of kids all at once. So really, really enjoy that moment. And, talking about the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, they did do the remake of the first one. Did you see the 2010 Nightmare? And if so, what were your thoughts on that one?
I saw it. I saw it in the theater, probably opening day. I saw it in Times Square, and I don't go to Times Square too often, but it was a packed house with a very boisterous crowd. And I think that was the one thing that really saved my viewing experience, because I am not a fan of the movie, but I do remember a lot of screaming, a lot of yelling at the screen. It was a really interactive, vocal crowd, which made the experience more fun because I wasn't too keen on the movie. I'm pretty sure it was opening night or opening weekend that I saw it. So I remember having fun. It was me, an ex, and another couple. But I'm not a fan of that movie. I say that, and I have not revisited it. I think I might have watched it once on DVD just to be like, let me see if I'm being too hard on this. Kind of felt the same way about it. That was probably 2012 or something. So it's probably been over a decade since I've revisited it. And I feel like that's kind of the common consensus. I'm always curious to hear if there's people who really love it and really want to defend it.
See, it's a movie that I really like. I think that Jackie Earle Haley was amazing as Freddy. He did what Robert Englund couldn't do as Freddy, and that's make you hate him. Like, a lot of people that I talk to, like, I hate that movie, man. Freddy was so bad. I'm like, that's the point. He's the bad guy. You're not supposed to like Freddy.
Right.
The problem is, Robert Englund was so full of charisma that you couldn't dislike him. You had to love him too.
Totally.
But Jackie, like, makes you hate him. Like, every time he's on screen, you're like, this guy's fucking gross. I think it has the best ending of any Nightmare on Elm Street movie. All the Nightmare on Elm Street movies have dog shit endings, in my opinion.
Well,
every single one.
That's true. And I think the thing that makes part 3 my favorite is that I remember reading the novelization of Dream Warriors, and the novelization was written off of the shooting script that was by Bruce Wagner and Wes Craven. And in that, they tried to do all kinds of stuff that was really unfilmable. It was like, there was a ton of weird, like, stuff playing with time and space and shape shifting and stuff. And it was just not grounded enough. And so Frank Darabont and Chuck Russell, who ended up directing the movie, sort of rewrote it and made it something that was filmable. And I feel like of the movies, it has the best structure. And even though the ending is not a great ending, I think it's stronger than the ending in part 1 and part 2 and in part 4 too. I watched parts 5, 6, and New Nightmare so infrequently that I often accidentally leave them out of discussion.
Yeah.
But I think,
I just think that, like I said, with the remake, there's definitely things that I can defend. It has some amazing kills, like that throat cut kill.
Mhm.
It's just so graphic and dark, and I don't
Yeah.
know, like there's things I like, but I could have used a little bit more originality out of the film.
Right. And Jackie Earle Haley, I mean, is kind of the best casting that you could do. Like you couldn't handpick someone else, I think, to
Right.
take over that role. I think that's the one area where they really nailed it. And I have nothing specifically negative to say about his performance. I don't know. Maybe I'll go back and revisit it. Maybe I'll walk away from this like, if I find an extra 90 minutes somewhere in the next few weeks, I'll toss it on and just give it another chance because it's been a while.
Well, if you do, please let me know. So, Jarrod, I've had an amazing time talking to you about your first horror movie and what that means to you. But before I let you go, we always bounce back to the same question. We're going to go back to the Dream Warriors, and what we're going to do is rank this movie on a skull count. Now, we're not ranking Dream Warriors on acting, production, score, direction, nothing like that. We're not being critics. All we're doing is ranking this movie on how much it affected you on your first viewing. So, 0 skulls being not effective, 5 being extremely effective. You can use half and quarter skulls anywhere in the middle. Jarrod, what would your ranking of the Dream Warriors be?
Oh boy. I mean, I'm going to deduct half a skull only because of the anecdote I told about Friday the 13th, A New Beginning
Yeah.
earlier. Because I feel like, had Dream Warriors not been the one that hit, there probably was another gateway to get in there. And I can hypothesize all day long about what that would have been, but we don't know. But I'm going to have to go 4.5 skulls because I think it's really hard to over exaggerate just how formative this movie was for me. I mean, if you're a person who's known me growing up, I mean, I always was into going to the video store, finding the weirdest movie on the shelf, making my big collection of horror VHS tapes grow and grow and grow. And then it was always something that I always gravitated towards it. And as an adult, I will say over the last few years, I started to drift into the world of content creator or person who has this as part of their outward personality. Because a lot of it would be like inward. It'd be like, okay, what do I do in my spare time? I watch horror movies. But if some of my old friends and I get together, let's throw that on for fun. But I eventually hit a point as an adult where I was like, no, this is such a big part of who I am as a person that it needs to be front and center. And so sometime maybe 10 years ago, I was like, I started thinking about what are my favorites? What are the movies that I go back to all the time? And, I bought a bunch of fun shirts and all this stuff. And now like my wife wants to kill me because I've got like 50 plus, horror shirts that I rotate all through spooky season. And I'm talking like some obscure shit. Like I'm wearing a Pieces t-shirt.
Yeah. Love that movie, man.
Yeah. And I've got for full moon or Charles Band related stuff, I've got a Puppet Master shirt. I've got a Tourist Trap shirt. I've got a Reanimator shirt. I've got a From Beyond shirt. I've got a shirt that just says produced and directed by Charles Band.
That's sick.
And I've just, my collection like keeps growing. And it's just, I think when I was a young adult, part of me was like, you can like this stuff, but you can't wholeheartedly embrace it as like an outward part of your personality. And then once I was a full grown up and a professional and I really knew who I was as a person, I was like, no, that would be unfair. Like it would be unfair for me to not hang horror posters in my home. It would be unfair to not wear these shirts and represent. Like I know a good amount of stuff. Like I go to Final Exam Trivia in Manhattan, which is an amazing expert level horror trivia that's hosted by Michael Gingold and Ted Gagan. And if you're a horror fan and you live in the tri-state area or you live in New York and you haven't checked it out, like you need to go check it out. And those interests of mine and talking about them on podcasts and writing about them is something that like once that was one, or I should say like once that dam broke, it was all out there. And that's all due really to Dream Warriors. Without Dream Warriors, I don't know if it would be as big a part of my life, but I mean, it's a huge part of my life. And if you listen to our show, Steve and I will end up going back to some anecdotes about being kids in the video store, or we'll compare scenes in a movie we're talking about to another movie. And when it's something that's really obscure, it's like, it's nice to be able to make a reference and have the other person know what you're talking about without naming the movie, like that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, 4.5 skulls. I couldn't possibly go any lower than that.
Right. Well, and I know I said this at the beginning, guys, but I do want to say it again because we are at the end of the third act. The credits are about to roll and the curtain's about to drop. But before that happens, I have all of Jarrod's social media links as well as the podcast links down in the description. So make sure you're subscribing to the podcast. Make sure you're following him and the podcast on social media so you can stay up to date on everything they have coming up. Jarrod, please don't go anywhere. I got a couple more questions for you.
Sure.
Everybody else, if you haven't already, please like and subscribe. It really does help the channel more than you know. And follow Sledgehammer Horror on social media. All our links are in the description as well. But until next time, keep talking horror, stay what you are, and we'll see you guys soon.